My name is Jody. I am 32. Last Tuesday morning, I sat motionless at the defendant's table in a freezing courtroom in upstate New York. Across from me, my birth mother's attorney held up a photograph. In the photo, I am wearing a coffee-stained apron, clutching a floor mop. A few snickers rippled through the gallery. My eyes locked onto Diane, the woman who gave birth to me. She was dabbing at bone-dry eyes with a tissue, but the corners of her mouth twitched into a satisfied smirk. She thinks that photo proves I am some low-rent servant, a piece of blue-collar trash unfit to touch my grandfather's $11 million estate. She is gloating. But they have no clue. I have been sitting here in total silence, waiting for this exact second for 3 months. No screaming, no defense. I just watch coldly as these smug traitors march straight into the minefield I rigged. If you are listening to this on noble revenge, and you have ever had your own bloodkin rip off the mask of family to stomp on you for a paycheck, leave a comment and hit subscribe. This story is for you. It did not actually start in this courtroom. It started with my grandfather's $11 million legacy. A Vietnam vet who came home from the dead with nothing but 37 crumpled dollars in his pocket. The heater in the corner of the room rumbled, a low industrial groan that vibrated through the floorboards of this upstate New York courtroom. It was the only sound besides the rustling of legal pads and the heavy, humid silence of people waiting for a car crash. The air was stale, tasting of old dust and desperate lies. Mitchell Voss didn't walk. He prowled. He circled the mahogany podium like a wolf measuring a fence line, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the stone tiles with a rhythmic, arrogant snap. He stopped and raised his hand toward the projector screen. The image flickered to life. Grainy, harsh, ugly. There I was. In the frame, I was hunched over a puddle of gray-green vomit on the checkered floor of Frank's diner. My face was obscured, but the coffee-stained apron was unmistakable. A dark, jagged smear ran across the front of it. I looked small. I looked broken. I looked like a woman who had finally run out of options. "Look at this," Voss said, his voice dropping into a theatrical, mocking baritone. He turned to face the jury, letting his eyes linger on each one of them as if sharing a dirty secret. This is the woman who claims she can manage an $11 million estate. A waitress. A floor scrubber who spends her Friday nights cleaning up after drunks for $5 tips. He paused, letting the word waitress hang in the stagnant air like a curse. To hand over the legacy of a war hero to a failed server. Your Honor, it isn't just an oversight. It is a blasphemy. The gallery rippled. A few muffled snickers broke the silence. A woman in the back row whispered something to her neighbor, her eyes darting toward me with a mix of pity and disgust. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I sat with my spine fused into a straight line, my shoulders squared in a perfect military bearing that none of them recognized. My hands were flat on my thighs, fingers relaxed, just as I'd been trained during tactical briefings at the Pentagon. I wasn't a waitress right now. I was a JAG officer in a hostile environment, and Mitchell Voss was nothing more than an enemy combatant overextending his line. I felt the sharp, metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I'd bitten the inside of my cheek hard enough to draw copper, using the pain to anchor myself. My eyes drifted to the left. Diane was sitting in the front row, wrapped in a plush sheepskin coat that cost more than 3 months of my base pay. She held a lace handkerchief to her eyes, her shoulders trembling with a performance that would have won her a daytime Emmy. She was the grieving mother, the victim of a cold-hearted, greedy daughter. Beside her, Richard Hale sat with his legs crossed, leaning back as if he already owned the building. He kept tapping the face of his Rolex, a knockoff I'd spotted the second he walked in. He wasn't even listening to the legal arguments. His eyes were glazed over, probably picturing himself behind the wheel of a new Porsche bought with my grandfather's blood money. "Jody," Elaine whispered beside me. I could feel the heat radiating off her. Elaine Park was a shark, a litigator who lived for the kill. Her hand was clenched so tight around her ballpoint pen that I thought the plastic would snap. She was waiting for the signal, one nod from me, and she'd be on her feet, tearing Voss's argument to shreds, with the military records hidden in our briefcase. I looked at her and slowly shook my head. Not yet. In the field, when the enemy is blood-drunk and charging, you don't fire. You wait. You let them run until they're deep inside the kill zone. You let them get so confident they stop looking at their feet. Voss was dancing in the minefield, and he didn't even know it. I tightened my jaw, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. I started to count my breaths. In through the nose, out through the mouth. 1, 2, 3. My heart rate was steady at 60 beats per minute. I was a stone. The gavel hit the wooden block, a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot in the room. Judge Torres pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose, her gaze shifting from Voss to me. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe a shred of disappointment. She was looking at the woman in the coffee-stained apron. "Defendant," the judge said, her voice dry and brittle. "Do you have any response to this photograph? Any explanation for why the primary trustee of an $11 million fund is moonlighting as a server?" I stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and perfectly controlled. I didn't lean on the table. I didn't stumble. I turned my head and looked directly at Diane. She hadn't realized I was looking. She'd lowered the handkerchief just enough to reveal the corner of her mouth. A smirk. A tiny, jagged line of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. And then, I smelled it. A thick, cloying cloud of perfume wafted toward the defense table. It was sweet, sickeningly so, like overripe lilies and cheap chemical musk. It was the kind of scent that sticks to the back of the throat. In an instant, the courtroom vanished. The humming heater was gone. The rustling paper was gone. The scent ripped through 20 years of scar tissue and dragged me backward. The sweet stink of Diane's perfume was suffocating. It fought against the only scent that had ever made me feel safe. The dry, honest smell of cedarwood. The smell of the chest where my grandfather kept his medals. The smell of his old workshop. But the perfume was winning. It was the same smell from the day the world turned cold. The day she looked at me and decided that I wasn't enough to keep her around. The day she threw me away like trash. The scent of that cheap lily perfume in the courtroom was a punch in the throat. It did not just smell like flowers. It smelled like the end of the world. It was a chemical stink that clung to the back of my throat, thick and suffocating, just like it was 20 years ago. 1998. I was 12 years old. The winter in upstate New York was a gray, biting beast that rattled the window panes. A rusted 1998 Pontiac Bonneville pulled up to the curb of our small house. The engine was rough, spitting blue smoke into the frozen air. I stood at the window, my breath fogging the glass, watching my mother, Diane. She did not pack much, just 2 oversized suitcases, the kind with the fake Louis Vuitton pattern that peeled at the corners. She did not look at me. She did not check if I had eaten. She simply threw her bags into the trunk and turned toward me with eyes that were already miles away. "This town is suffocating me, Jody," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of a single ounce of warmth. "I need to live for myself now. You will be fine. You have your grandfather." That was it. No hug. No, "I love you." She got into the car, the door slammed with a heavy metallic thud, and the Pontiac roared away. I stood there, barefoot on the freezing hardwood floor, until my toes went numb. I watched the taillights disappear into the gray mist, leaving behind nothing but the smell of exhaust and that cloying, sweet perfume. I did not cry. I could not, because I felt the heavy, calloused hand of Walter Pierce rest on my shoulder. My grandfather was a man made of flint and iron. He had returned from the jungles of Vietnam with $37 in his pocket, a chest full of medals he never talked about, and a leg full of shrapnel that made him limp whenever the weather turned cold. He did not believe in soft words. He believed in survival. That night, the house was silent. The only sound was the clicking of his metal Zippo lighter. He sat me down at the kitchen table and pushed a yellow legal pad and a pen toward me. "Tears do not pay the bills, Jody," he said. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. "Wiping your eyes won't put wood in the stove. Make a list. What needs to be done tomorrow? 5 items. Start now." That was my childhood. While other girls were obsessed with boy bands and the upcoming middle school dance, I was sitting in a dim garage, learning how to change the oil in a truck. While they went to the prom in silk dresses, I was sitting in the corner of a dusty office, analyzing cash flow charts for abandoned strip malls. Walter Pierce did not build an $11 million empire with luck. He built it with blood and an obsession for commercial real estate that no one else wanted. He bought ghost towns. He bought rusted warehouses. He taught me how to spot a liar by the way their fingers tapped on a desk. He taught me that trust was a luxury we could not afford. "Look at their eyes, Jody," he would tell me, the scent of cedar wood from his cigar box floating around us. "If they cannot hold your gaze when they talk about money, they are already planning how to steal yours." By the time I was 18, I was more of a soldier than a teenager. I joined the army not to escape, but to prove I was made of the same iron as him. I climbed the ranks in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. I handled logistics for multi-million-dollar defense contracts. I earned a top-secret security clearance. I built a wall around my heart so thick that I thought nothing could ever break it. I was a captain. I was a professional. I was untouchable. Then, 2 years ago, the wall crumbled. It happened on a Tuesday. I was at the Pentagon, finishing a report on a fuel supply chain, when my phone vibrated. It was Frank, the owner of the diner back home. "Jody," he said, "your grandfather, he went down in the kitchen. Hard." I drove 10 hours straight. When I walked into that hospital room, the man who had been my mountain looked like a shadow. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen tank was the only thing filling the silence. His Zippo lighter, the one he had carried since 1968, sat on the bedside table, cold and silent. The doctor stepped into the hallway with me. He did not sugarcoat it. He was an American veteran himself, and he gave it to me straight. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, he said. "It has already spread to the liver. 3 to 6 months, Captain. Maybe less if we are unlucky." I looked through the glass at my grandfather. He was gasping for air, his hand weakly reaching for the cedarwood box he always kept nearby. At that moment, my career at the Pentagon meant nothing. The promotion orders that were sitting on my desk back in Washington, the ones that would have made me a major, felt like trash. I took the promotion letter out of my bag. It was a thick, formal document with the Department of Defense seal. I looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then, I gripped the edges and ripped it in half. Then again, and again. Until it was just white confetti in the hospital trash can. If you have ever had to choose between your career and the person who actually raised you, hit the like button right now. Tell me in the comments, would you have stayed? Right, I stayed, or I left. I need to know I am not the only one who would sacrifice everything for loyalty. I walked back into the room and took my grandfather's hand. It felt like dry parchment. "I am not going back, Walter," I whispered. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with pain. But for a second, the old Flint was back. He knew what I had given up. And he knew the war was just beginning. I reached for the phone and called the JAG office. I did not ask for permission. I told them I was filing for compassionate reassignment. I told them I was going home. I did not know then that Diane was watching. I did not know that she had already seen the dollar signs in my grandfather's declining health. The vultures were already circling the house. I pulled the trigger on the only favor the Army ever owed me: compassionate reassignment. They didn't make it easy. The brass at the Pentagon doesn't like losing their best logistics officers to family matters. But they moved me. They sent me from the high-pressure halls of D.C. to a decaying, drafty logistics depot, 40 miles from my front door in upstate New York. It was a warehouse for obsolete parts, a place where careers went to die, but it was close enough. My life became a jagged, exhausting split screen. By day, I sat in a secure room behind 2 inches of reinforced steel, staring at encrypted monitors. I managed $30 million supply chains for active combat zones, moving fuel, ammo, and medicine across 3 different continents. I was the cold voice of authority. When I walked through the depot, younger officers clicked their heels, the sound of their boots sharp on the concrete. They saw a captain. They saw a woman with a chest full of ribbons and a mind like a tactical computer. But the second the clock hit 1700, the uniform came off. The captain vanished. I'd drive through the freezing rain to the house on the hill, my hands still smelling of diesel and old paper. Inside that house, I wasn't an officer. I was a ghost. I was a girl with a stethoscope and a bottle of high-dose morphine. I changed his heavy, soiled diapers. I scrubbed the smell of sickness off the bathroom floor. I spent hours spoon-feeding lukewarm beef broth to the man who had once taught me how to jumpstart a truck in a blizzard. Every swallow he took felt like a hard-won victory. Then the cancer turned a corner. It stopped being a slow rot and became an ambush. I couldn't be away for 40 minutes, let alone 40 miles. His breathing was becoming a ragged, desperate sound that haunted my sleep. I couldn't leave him alone. I took my Class A uniform, the sharp navy blue, the crisp white shirt, the silver oak leaf insignias, and locked it in the dark of the closet. I walked 2 blocks down to Frank's Diner. The place smelled of old grease, burnt toast, and cheap tobacco. I walked up to the counter, my eyes sunken into my skull from a week without real sleep. Frank didn't ask for a resume. He didn't ask why a woman with my posture was looking for a part-time shift at a hole-in-the-wall diner. He looked at my shaking hands, reached under the counter, and handed me a heavy canvas apron. It was stained with 3 years of coffee and grease. "Shift starts now," he said, turning back to the grill. That job was my lifeline. Not for the money, the tips were insults, but for the distance. It allowed me to drop the mop and run home every 60 minutes to check if his heart was still beating. I'd sprint through the back alley, burst through the kitchen door, and stand over his bed until I saw the slight, frail rise of his chest. Then I'd run back, tie the apron, and take another order for eggs over easy. The generals back in D.C. would have had a stroke if they'd seen me. Their star pupil, the JAG prodigy, was now scrubbing grease off the floor for men who didn't even look at her face. To the town, I was just a failed waitress who couldn't cut it in the real world. To me, that diner was a forward operating base. The apron was my new armor. The night of the photo was a Tuesday. A lake-effect blizzard had slammed into the town, turning the world into a howling, white-out void. I had been awake for 36 hours straight. I'd spent the morning coordinating a secret logistics shipment for a base in Germany and the evening dodging drunks at Frank's. Around 2 a.m., a regular in a corner booth, some guy who had lost his job at the mill, got sick. It wasn't pretty. I didn't wait for anyone else. I grabbed the bucket and the mop. I was a JAG officer, but duty is duty. I knelt in the cold slush and the filth, scrubbing the floor because it needed to be done. My hands were raw from the bleach. I hauled the heavy, dripping trash bag out to the alley. The wind caught me, and my boots slipped on a patch of black ice. I went down hard. My knees slammed into the frozen concrete. The bag split, and a foul mix of muddy slush and cold coffee grounds soaked into my apron, turning it into a heavy, wet mess. Flash. A strobe of white light cut through the falling snow. It came from a black sedan idling by the dumpsters. I didn't look up. I didn't care about some creep with a camera. My phone was vibrating in my pocket. The remote heart monitor app was screaming. His pulse was thready, failing. I didn't even take the apron off. I just ran. The freezing air felt like broken glass in my lungs as I sprinted the 2 blocks home, my feet skidding on the treacherous ice. I burst through the door, my clothes soaked and smelling of trash, and made it to his bedside just as his eyes drifted shut for the last time. He died that afternoon. The house was suddenly, violently quiet. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the heavy, stagnant smell of antiseptic. The funeral was a cold, lonely affair. There was a flag-draped casket and a three-volley salute that cracked like lightning over the frozen ground. A young sergeant, no older than I was when I enlisted, knelt before me and handed me the folded triangle of the American flag. Diane didn't show. I heard later she was on a private yacht in the Caribbean, sipping cocktails while the man who raised her was being lowered into the cold New York dirt. She didn't call. She didn't send a card. She stayed silent until 3 weeks later when the law firm sent out the formal notices. $11 million. The doorbell rang at 8 a.m. on a rainy Monday. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. I stood in the dim hallway, looking at the door. I could already smell that cloying, sweet perfume through the cracks in the old wood. It was a scent that didn't belong in a house of mourning. The vultures had finally found the carcass. I reached for the handle. The battle for my grandfather's soul was over, but the war for his legacy was just starting. The silence in the house was a physical weight. The grandfather was gone, and the echo of his ragged breathing had been replaced by a stillness that made my ears ring. I sat at the kitchen table on the night after the funeral, the only light coming from the flickering bulb over the stove. Before me sat the cedar wood box, its rough, unfinished surface a sharp contrast to the cold, sterile reality of the last 3 months. I flipped the latch. It didn't click. It groaned. Inside lay the legal documents, the formal, notarized will, and a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper covered in Walter's cramped, jagged handwriting. He didn't write like a poet. He wrote like a man who had spent his life measuring risk in the mud. The decree, his final words, hit me like a blunt object. I love my daughter. The ink was thick, pressed hard into the paper. But love is not the same thing as trust. Jody, if your mother comes back, know that she is coming for the coins in a dead man's eyes. She will be here for the money. I am choosing you because you are the one who stayed. You are the one who stood your ground. The numbers were cold. Diane was left exactly $200,000. A parting gift, Walter called it. The rest? The $11 million in commercial real estate, the trust funds, the managed accounts? Every cent was mine. I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. My jaw was tight. I was a sentry now, guarding a legacy that vultures were already circling. 6 days later, the doorbell didn't ring. It shrieked. I didn't rush. I walked to the door with the same measured pace I used when walking toward a disciplinary hearing. I pulled the heavy oak door open. There they were. Diane Pierce was standing on the porch, clutching a knockoff Hermes bag so tight her knuckles were white. Her face was a mask of expensive foundation and desperation. Behind her stood Richard Hale, the new husband. He had the slick, oily look of a man who spent his days rolling back odometers on used cars. He wore a suit that was a shade too shiny, and that fake Rolex from the courtroom was still ticking on his wrist. Diane didn't wait for an invite. She pushed past me into the foyer, her sharp stiletto heels snapping against the hardwood floor like a volley of small arms fire. She stopped in the middle of the living room and began waving her hand in front of her face, a look of pure disgust twisting her features. "My God, Jody," she scoffed, her voice shrill. "It smells like a nursing home in here. That antiseptic stinks. How can you breathe in this tomb?" I felt a surge of cold fury. I had breathed that smell for 2 years. I had lived in it, slept in it, and scrubbed it off the floorboards so her father could die with a shred of dignity while she was sipping margaritas on a boat. I didn't say a word. I leaned against the doorframe and crossed my arms, my eyes tracking Richard as he kicked the leg of a mahogany end table, gauging the wood's value. I didn't offer water. I didn't turn on the heat. I let the winter chill settle into the room. Then came the performance. Diane's eyes welled up with practiced crocodile tears. She lunged forward, her arms open, her perfume, that cloying, sweet stench, hitting me like a physical wall. "Oh, my baby girl," she wailed, her voice cracking for the rafters. "I am so sorry I didn't make it back in time. My heart is just shattered." Poor Walter. He must have been so confused at the end. Delirious, really, to leave such a heavy burden on your shoulders. I stepped to the side, letting her stumble into the empty air. The hug died before it started. Richard stepped in then, closing the distance. He smelled of artificial mint and old cigarettes. He leaned over the dining table, his fingers drumming a rhythmic, predatory beat on the wood. "Let's be real here, Jody," Richard said, his voice a low, condescending rumble. "A girl who spends her nights pouring coffee and scrubbing vomit at Frank's doesn't know the first thing about property taxes or asset management. You're out of your league. We just want to help you. We want to make sure you don't blow the family legacy on something stupid." He used the word help, but his eyes were like bayonets, fixed on the prize. He saw a waitress. He saw a failed server who was an easy mark. He didn't see the captain standing right in front of him. I looked directly into his pupils. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until Diane stopped her fake sniffing. "This estate doesn't need your help," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "And this house doesn't need your presence. Both of you. Out. Now." Richard's face turned a violent shade of red. The nice guy mask slipped, revealing the parasite underneath. He grabbed Diane's arm and pulled her toward the door, his movements jerky and filled with suppressed rage. As he stepped onto the porch, he stopped. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. "You picked the wrong side, kid," he hissed through clenched teeth. "You think that little apron is going to protect you in a courtroom? We're going to strip you bare." He slammed the car door so hard the Pontiac rattled. 11 days later, the war officially started. I was at Frank's, wiping down the counter after the lunch rush, when a man in a cheap windbreaker walked in. He didn't order coffee. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick white envelope, and shoved it into my hand. A summons. A lawsuit to contested the will. The vultures weren't just circling anymore, they were diving. The envelope was thick, heavy, white. It sat on the grease-stained counter of Frank's diner like a landmine waiting for a footstep. I did not open it right away. I finished wiping down the back of the industrial espresso machine first. The rhythmic hum of the machine was the only thing keeping the silence from crushing the room. I slid my thumb under the paper flap. The edge was sharp, cold. Lack of professional qualification. Financial incompetence. Manipulation of a vulnerable person. The words were jagged. They were designed to cut. I gripped the edges of the legal summons so hard my fingertips began to throb. The skin turned white, then a bruised, angry purple. A small smear of blood from a fresh paper cut blurred the word server. I was not just a server. I was a United States Army officer with a top-secret security clearance. I had managed logistics chains that fed 10,000 soldiers in active war zones. I had personally audited my grandfather's trust, bringing in a 14% annual return while these two were busy maxing out credit cards at the mall. And yet, here it was, in black and white. To the state of New York, I was a fraud, a failure. A lowlife who had drugged an old man just to secure a paycheck. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was an encrypted line, tactical, secure. "Elaine," I said into the receiver. My voice was a flat, dead thing. "It is time." 9 o'clock. The diner was empty. The neon open sign flickered in the window, casting a sickly red glow over the cracked vinyl booths. The smell of old fryer oil and harsh floor cleaner hung in the air like a fog. It was the smell of the life they thought I deserved. The bell over the door chimed. Elaine Park walked in. She did not look like she belonged in a place that served $3 breakfast specials. She was sharp, lethal. Her heels clicked against the linoleum with the precision of a metronome. She sat at the counter and pulled a thick folder from her leather briefcase. She did not order coffee. She did not ask how I was doing. She just laid out the battle map. "Richard Hale is not a businessman," Elaine said. Her voice was like a razor blade through silk. "He is a parasite, a bottom feeder." She slid a bank report across the scratched wood of the counter. "He owes the bank $3 million. 3 of his commercial properties are already in the foreclosure process. The notices were mailed 2 weeks ago. He is drowning, Jody. He does not want Walter's money to build a legacy. He wants it to keep the repo man from taking his shiny toys and his fake lifestyle." I tapped my finger against the counter. The rhythm was steady, controlled. I watched the blue light from her laptop reflect in the stainless steel of the napkin dispenser. "So he is desperate," I said. "Desperate men make mistakes. They get loud, they get sloppy." Elaine clicked her pen. A sharp, repetitive sound. Click, click, click. "We can end this tomorrow," she said. She leaned forward, the blue screen light making her eyes look like ice. "I have your military records. I have your commendations, your certifications in logistics and military law." We walk into that courtroom, throw this on the judge's desk, and watch Voss choke on his own expensive tie. We crush the incompetence narrative before they even open their mouths. I stared at the black liquid in my cup. Bitter, cold, espresso without a grain of sugar. The taste was like charcoal and battery acid. I liked the burn of it. It kept me grounded. "No," I said. Elaine stopped clicking the pen. "No. In military theory, when the enemy thinks they have a superior position, you do not correct them," I said. "You let them overextend. You let them stretch their supply lines until they snap. You let them get so comfortable in their own arrogance that they forget to look behind them." I pointed to the stained canvas apron hanging on the peg by the kitchen door, the one with the mud and the dark coffee stains from the night I fell in the frozen slush. They want a low-class server. They want a failure. They want a girl who cannot count past 20 without using her toes. Fine, I will give them exactly what they want to see. I will wear their insults like a uniform. Elaine watched me. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her face. She understood. This was not a defense. This was a textbook ambush. "You are going to let them use that photo?" she asked. "I am going to let them build their entire case on it," I replied. "I want them to spend every ounce of their energy mocking me. I want Voss to feel like he has already won. Arrogance is a far better weapon for me than any evidence I have in this folder." The next morning, I did not go to the tailor. I did not put on the Class A uniform that was still pressed and waiting in the dark of my closet. I went to a thrift store on the edge of town. I found a navy blue suit. It was old. The fabric was thin at the elbows and smelled of mothballs and other people's disappointments. The suit jacket was a size too large, sagging on my frame. No insignia, no name tag, no medals. I stood in front of the cracked mirror in the back of the store. I adjusted the lapels. I stood tall, my spine straight, my chin level. I looked like a waitress trying to look professional. I looked like a girl who was terrified of losing. I was going to walk into that courtroom and let my mother and her pet lawyer dig a hole so deep they would never see the light of day again. The shredder in the corner of the office began to hum, a low, mechanical growl as Elaine destroyed the first draft of our motion. We were not playing by their rules anymore. "We move at dawn," I said. Elaine nodded. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Jody," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "I found something else, about the night Walter went into the hospital." I froze. The cold air from the diner's old ventilation system hit the back of my neck. "What?" "The phone logs," Elaine said. She held up a single sheet of paper. Diane did not just ignore your calls. She made a call of her own, to the hospital, an hour before you arrived. The silence returned, heavier than before. Why? I asked. Elaine looked at the paper, then back at me. She was not asking how he was, Elaine whispered. She was asking how long he had left before his signature became legally invalid. She was timing his death to match her greed. The air in the courtroom was a dead thing, stagnant. It tasted of old paper, floor wax, and the metallic tang of the humming fluorescent lights overhead. Mitchell Voss stood by the projector screen, his thumb hooked in his waistcoat pocket, looking like a man who had already cashed his win bonus check. He didn't just want the money, he wanted the public execution of my character. He signaled to the bailiff. The prosecution calls Diane Pierce to the stand. My mother walked toward the witness box with the slow, practiced gait of a tragic heroine. She wore a black dress, modest, somber, and expensive. She carried a small lace handkerchief, clutching it against her heart as if it were the only thing keeping her soul from shattering. She didn't look at me. She looked at the jury, her eyes rimmed with a perfect, calculated red. The microphone buzzed as she leaned in. The sound was a sharp, grating hiss that cut through the silence. It is so hard to talk about, Diane whispered. Every sniffle was amplified, every wet breath echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Voss leaned in, his voice a soothing, predatory hum. We know this is difficult, Mrs. Pierce. Tell the court about the final months of Walter's life. He was not himself, she sobbed, burying her face in the lace. My father was a strong man, but at the end he was confused, demented. Jody, she kept me away. She told me he didn't want to see me. She isolated him in that house, filling his head with lies while she worked him like a puppet. I think she was using those medications to keep him compliant, to force his hand on that will. She looked at the judge, a single tear escaping and rolling down her cheek. She is just a server in a diner. She has no future. She saw $11 million and saw a way out of the grease and the grime. My father was a meal ticket to her. Nothing more. I sat perfectly still. My spine was a steel rod. I watched the way her lace handkerchief didn't actually have any moisture on it. I watched the way she checked the jury's reaction after every sentence. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a cold, surgical detachment. My heart rate sat at exactly 60 beats per minute. Then came Richard. He stepped onto the stand like he was walking onto a stage at a corporate retreat. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed his hair, and gave the room a confident, "Trust me," smile. He was the picture of American success, polished, tan, and completely hollow. As a businessman with decades of experience in asset management, Richard started, his voice booming and arrogant. I cannot sit by and watch a legacy like Walter's be flushed down the drain. We are talking about complex commercial real estate, tax-sheltered accounts, and multi-million-dollar portfolios. These aren't things you learn while pouring refills for truckers. He turned his head toward me, a sneer curling his lip. It was a look of pure, unadulterated class contempt. Jody doesn't even own a car that runs. She lives in a house she didn't pay for. She has no degree in finance, no experience in the private sector, and quite frankly, no business being in charge of anything more complicated than a mop bucket. Giving her $11 million is like giving a toddler a loaded handgun. Voss leaned back, his hands spread wide. In your professional opinion, Mr. Hale, does the defendant possess the mental or professional capacity to handle this estate? Richard let out a short, mocking laugh. The girl cleans up vomit for $5 tips, Mitchell. Unless she knows how to turn coffee beans into gold bars, I'd say she's about as qualified as the pigeons in the park. The gallery erupted. A wave of snickers and muffled laughter rolled through the room. A man in the second row shook his head, looking at me with a mix of pity and mockery. The failed waitress narrative had taken hold. To them, I was a joke, a bottom feeder trying to play in the big leagues. Judge Torres slammed her gavel. The crack of wood on wood sounded like a gunshot. Order! I will have order in this court. I reached for the plastic cup on the table. The water was lukewarm and tasted like the plastic it was sitting in. I took a slow sip. I didn't look at Richard. I looked at the way the light hit the dust motes dancing in the air. I was a ghost. I was the shadow they didn't see coming. Voss sat down, a smug grin plastered on his face. He looked at Elaine and gestured with a flick of his wrist, as if to say, "Your turn to fail." If you have ever been the one who stayed behind to do the hard work while everyone else ran for the exits, hit that like button right now. I want to see the real ones. Drop a loyalty in the comments if you believe that showing up matters more than a fancy suit. Tell me, have you ever been mocked for the job you had to take? Elaine Park stood up. She didn't have a projector. She didn't have a dramatic performance. She slowly buttoned her blazer, the sound of the button sliding into the hole, the only noise in the sudden silence. She walked to the center of the floor, carrying a single, thin sheet of white paper. She didn't look at the jury. She didn't look at the judge. She walked straight to the witness stand and stopped inches from Richard Hale. Elaine leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the room. It was the sound of a blade being drawn from a scabbard. "Mr. Hale," Elaine said, "you talk a lot about financial competence and asset management. You seem very concerned about the safety of Walter Pierce's money." Richard straightened his tie, his chest puffing out. "I am. It is a matter of principle." "I see." Elaine held up the paper in her hand. "Then perhaps you can explain this. This is the official foreclosure list from the central bank, dated 3 days ago. Can you tell the court why 4 of your commercial properties are currently being seized by the state for non-payment of $3 million in debt?" The color drained from Richard's face so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. The businessman mask didn't just slip, it shattered. That is a private matter," he stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "Is it?" Elaine asked, her voice hardening. "Or is the only reason you're in this courtroom because you need $11 million to keep yourself out of a bankruptcy filing?" The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. Richard gripped the edges of the witness stand until his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting toward Diane, who had suddenly stopped crying. The predator had just become the prey. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen out of the room until Richard Hale started to look like a fish out of water, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. The $3.2 million debt hung over his head like a guillotine blade, and Elaine had just pulled the lever. His expensive tan turned into a sickly, gray smear. He looked smaller in his shiny suit, the padding in the shoulders suddenly making him look like a child wearing his father's clothes. 3 commercial properties in foreclosure, Mr. Hale, Elaine said. Her voice didn't rise. It stayed low, a steady, lethal hum that vibrated through the floorboards. A net debt of $3.2 million across 4 different lenders. You didn't come to this town to protect Walter's legacy. You came here to rob a dead man's grave because you're sinking and you need a life raft. Richard collapsed back into his chair. The wood groaned under his weight. His businessman mask didn't just slip, it turned to ash. Beside him, Diane's fake tears dried up instantly. She looked at Richard, then at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Mitchell Voss surged to his feet. He was sweating now, a dark stain spreading under the arms of his $3,000 blazer. The smell of his fear hit me, cold, sour, and desperate. "Objection!" Voss barked, his voice jumping an octave. "This is a desperate attempt at character assassination. It has zero relevance to the fact that the defendant is an uneducated server who is clearly unfit to manage a trust of this magnitude." Judge Torres didn't look at him. She was looking at me. She leaned forward over the bench, her eyes narrowing behind her glasses. "Counselor Voss, sit down before I find you in contempt." "Attorney Park, proceed." I felt the familiar, cold focus settle in my chest. It was the same feeling I had in the back of a Humvee outside Kandahar. The target was painted, the coordinates were locked. I turned my head slightly and caught Elaine's eye. I gave her the slightest, almost invisible nod. Clear to engage. Elaine reached into her leather briefcase. She didn't pull out a legal pad or a glossy chart. She pulled out a thick, heavy folder bound in olive drab. The unmistakable flat green of the United States Army. She walked into the center of the well, her heels striking the stone floor with the finality of a hammer on a nail. The opposition has spent hours talking about a coffee-stained apron, Elaine said, her voice cutting through the stagnant air. They have called my client a failure, a low-class server, a woman who cannot count. So, let's talk about her actual resume. She slapped the folder onto the evidence table. Whack! The sound echoed like a gunshot. State University, full academic scholarship, 6 years of active duty service. Elaine began, her voice gaining a sharp, rhythmic edge. She isn't a waitress, Mr. Voss. She is Captain Jody Pierce, a commissioned officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps and the Logistics Command of the United States Army. The air left the room. I watched Diane's jaw drop. Her lace handkerchief fell from her fingers and drifted to the floor, forgotten. Richard's hands began to shake so hard he had to tuck them under his thighs. Captain Pierce holds a top-secret security clearance, Elaine continued, walking toward the jury box. She held up a page from the folder, the official Department of Defense seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. While she was pouring coffee, she was remotely managing logistics projects for the North Atlantic base, overseeing budgets exceeding $30 million. She didn't just count change, she moved armies. I stood up then. I didn't need to be told. I stood with my spine fused into a steel rod, my chin level, my eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. I was back in uniform, even in my thrift store suit. In the 4 years Captain Pierce has been silently managing her grandfather's trust, Elaine said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. The fund has seen a 14% annual growth rate. Every tax cent was paid. Every asset was protected. She did it with the same military discipline she used in the field. She wore that apron so she could be within 5 minutes of her dying grandfather while Diane was sipping cocktails in the Caribbean. Voss stood frozen. He was holding his gold-plated pen, but his fingers were trembling so much the tip was scratching uselessly against his legal pad. He looked like a man who had brought a knife to a tank fight. The defense moves to dismiss this case immediately, Elaine said, turning toward the bench. And we request an immediate investigation into Richard Hale's financial motives for filing this frivolous suit. Judge Torres looked at the olive drab folder, then back at me. A small, dry smile touched her lips. I think I've seen enough for one afternoon. Diane lunged forward then. She grabbed the edge of the table, her face contorting into a new mask. The grieving mother was gone. The vulture was gone. Now she was the victim. Jody, she wailed, her voice cracking for the gallery. I'm your mother. How could you do this to me? I was just trying to protect you from yourself. You should have told me. We're family. Elaine didn't even look at her. She reached into her bag one last time and pulled out a single, sealed envelope. Speaking of family, Mrs. Pierce, Elaine said, her smile turning sharp and dangerous. I have something else. It was found in the back of Walter's safe. It's a letter. Addressed to you. Written the day before he died. The blood left Diane's face again. She stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. Should I read it to the court? Elaine asked. The silence returned, heavier and more terrifying than before. The battle was over. The execution was about to begin. Diane lunged across the defense table, her fingers clawing at the air as if she could shred the olive drab folder Elaine held. Her grieving mother mask was gone, replaced by a jagged, ugly desperation. The foundation on her face was cracking, revealing the deep, bitter lines of a woman who had run out of lies. It is a lie, Diane shrieked. Her voice was like a saw blade hitting a knot in a piece of pine. She is a manipulative little bitch. I am her mother. I have the right to decide what happens to my father's money. He was old. He was senile. He did not know what he was signing. Elaine did not flinch. She did not even blink. She slowly reached into the side pocket of her briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper, sealed inside a clear plastic evidence bag. The edges were frayed, and the ink was a dark, bruised blue. This was found in the back of Walter Pierce's workshop safe, Elaine said. Her voice was low, carrying a weight that forced the room into a suffocating silence. It is notarized, dated 72 hours before his heart stopped. She walked to the center of the room and began to read. Walter's voice, rough and honest, seemed to fill the cracks in the walls. Jody, Elaine read, and I felt the cold grip of my grandfather's hand in those words. If your mother comes back, know that it is not for me. It is for the coins in a dead man's eyes. She stayed away when the work was hard. She stayed away when the pain was real. She will come back for the money. I am choosing you because you are the one who stayed. You are the one who stood your ground when the wolves were at the door. Do not let them take what we built. Diane's knees hit the floor. The sound of her hitting the carpet was heavy and final. She didn't cry for her father. She didn't cry for the daughter she had abandoned. She let out a high, thin wail for the $11 million that was slipping through her greedy fingers. She looked at Richard, but the businessman was busy staring at his own shoes, his face the color of wet cement. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound of boots hit the marble floor, sharp, rhythmic, and heavy. It was a sound I knew in my marrow. I stood up before I even saw him. Military bearing is not something you turn off. It is a permanent part of your skeleton. Colonel James Patterson walked down the aisle. He was in full Class A uniform. The silver oak leaves on his shoulders caught the harsh fluorescent light, glinting like ice. He did not look at the lawyers. He did not look at the gallery. He walked straight to the witness stand, his back as straight as a bayonet. Voss tried to stand, his hand trembling as he reached for his water glass. Your Honor, this witness was not on the list. Sit down, Mitchell, Judge Torres said. Her voice was a dry rasp. Colonel, please state your name for the record. James Patterson, United States Army. His voice was like gravel grinding in a drum. He turned his head and looked at me. It was not a look of pity. It was a look of recognition. Captain Jody Pierce served under my direct command for 4 years. She was the finest logistics and JAG officer I have ever had the honor to lead. If I had to pick 5 people to go into a dark hole with, she would be at the top of that list. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the hum of the heater and the ragged, broken breathing of Diane on the floor. She did not ask for a discharge, the colonel continued, his eyes boring into the jury. She asked for a compassionate reassignment so she could wipe the brow of a dying veteran. She took a job in a diner because it was the only way she could be close enough to her grandfather to hear him breathe. That is not incompetence. That is the highest form of duty I've ever witnessed. Judge Torres pushed her glasses up. She looked at the olive drab folder. She looked at the letter. Then she looked at me. Captain Pierce, the judge said, and for the first time, her voice was almost soft. Why didn't you end this on day 1? Why didn't you bring the colonel in a month ago and stop this circus? I stood with my hands clasped behind my back. I looked at the photo Mitchell Voss had used to humiliate me, the one of me kneeling in the filth at Frank's. Because my grandfather taught me that a title does not make the person, Your Honor, I said. My voice was steady, a flat line of cold truth. I wore that apron because it was what needed to be done. I knelt in that slush because my grandfather needed me 5 minutes away, not 40 miles away at a base. They thought they could use that dirt to shame me. But the grease and the mud on that canvas are cleaner than the lies in their 3-piece suits. I would wear it again tomorrow if it meant I could hold his hand for one more minute. Judge Torres nodded slowly. She reached for her gavel. The wood felt heavy in her hand. This court finds the plaintiff's claims to be not only without merit, but an affront to the integrity of this legal system, she said. Her eyes locked onto Mitchell Voss, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The petition to contest the will is dismissed with prejudice. And Counselor Voss, I am referring your conduct to the Ethics Committee for the blatant use of deceptive character assassination. Crack! The gavel hit the block. The sound was like a gunshot, echoing through the room and bearing the lies of the last 6 months. I didn't stay to watch them scramble. I didn't look at Diane as she begged Richard to stay. I walked out of that courtroom, the colonel's boots echoing behind me. I stepped out into the cold gray light of upstate New York. The war was over, but the silence of the aftermath was just beginning. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind me with a dull, final thud. The sound echoed through the marble hallway, a cold, hollow noise that signaled the end of the massacre. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a cleanup operation after a particularly messy roadside ambush. I adjusted the strap of my bag, my fingers brushing the rough canvas of the olive drab folder. The hallway was a gauntlet of shattered egos. Richard Hale was 20 feet ahead of me, his heels clicking frantically against the stone floor. He wasn't walking, he was fleeing. He had his phone pinned to his ear, his voice a desperate, jagged rasp that carried through the corridor. Cancel the wire. I said cancel it. The New York deal is dead. I don't have the collateral. Do you hear me? The bank is going to freeze everything by morning. He didn't look back. He didn't look at the woman trailing 3 steps behind him, trying to catch his sleeve. Diane reached for him, her hand trembling. Richard, wait. We can talk to Voss. We can find a loophole. My father was clearly out of his mind. Richard spun around, his face a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. He didn't just shake her off. He shoved her hand away like it was a piece of rotting meat. He didn't care about the cameras or the few stragglers watching from the benches. Get away from me, Diane, he spat. The businessman was gone. The slick, polished version of the man who had walked in that morning had been replaced by a cornered rat. You told me this was a slam dunk. You told me your daughter was a nobody, a waitress. You cost me $3 million and my reputation in this state. You're useless to me now. Stay in this dump of a town for all I care. I'm done. He didn't wait for a response. He stepped into the elevator, the silver doors sliding shut on their marriage before she could even utter a word. The parasite had realized the host was dry. He was moving on to the next kill, leaving his wreckage behind. Diane stood there in the center of the hallway. She looked like a ghost that had stayed up too late. The expensive foundation she'd applied so carefully that morning was cracked, and her mascara had bled into the fine lines around her eyes, turning into black, ugly smears. She wasn't the grieving daughter anymore. She wasn't even the victim. She was just a woman who had bet everything on a lie and lost. She saw me. Her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, narrowed into slits. The hatred in them was physical, a cold heat that radiated across the 10 feet of space between us. She didn't move to hug me. She didn't apologize for the 20 years of silence or the 6 months of legal hell. She moved to block my path to the exit. You think you've won, she hissed. Her voice was a low, vibrating growl, the sound of a predator that had lost its teeth but still wanted to bite. You think that little military stunt makes you better than me. You're still just a girl who scrubs floors in a greasy spoon. You took my inheritance. You poisoned my father against me. I am going to appeal this. I am going to drag your name through the mud until everyone in this county knows what a manipulative little bitch you really are. I stopped. I didn't shift my weight. I didn't tighten my grip on my bag. I stood with my spine a straight line of cold steel, the way Colonel Patterson had taught me on my first day of OCS. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see a mother. I didn't even see an enemy. I saw a tragedy. I saw a woman who had traded every ounce of her soul for a lifestyle she couldn't afford and a man who never loved her. The anger I'd been carrying, the burning knot in my chest that had kept me awake for months, just evaporated. It was gone, replaced by a heavy, silent pity. "I stayed," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was flat, a dead reckoning of the truth. It was the only answer that mattered. It was the answer to every question she hadn't asked. Why did he leave me the money? Why did he trust me? Why am I the one standing here? "I stayed," I repeated, my voice like stone hitting deep water. "I held his hand when he couldn't remember your name. I changed his linens while you were out on a boat. I was there for the work. You were only here for the payout." Diane opened her mouth to scream, to lash out, to weave another web of gaslighting. But the words died in her throat. She looked at me, and she saw the one thing she couldn't manipulate: the truth. I didn't wait for her to move. I stepped around her, my shoulder brushing past her silk blazer. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. That bridge wasn't just burned, it had been demolished. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse. The winter air of upstate New York hit me like a physical blow, sharp and honest. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun dipping behind the gray jagged line of the mountains. In the middle of the salt-stained parking lot, a black SUV was idling. Colonel Patterson was leaning against the fender, his arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't wearing his hat, and the wind was catching his gray hair. He saw me, and he straightened up. He didn't offer a good job or a Hallmark card sentiment. He didn't need to. He snapped his heels together. The sound was sharp, a military rhythm that cut through the sound of the wind. He brought his hand to his brow in a slow, perfect salute. A salute from one soldier to another. A salute to the girl who had held the line when the world was falling apart. I stopped. I felt the weight on my shoulders lift, disappearing into the cold Adirondack air. I snapped my heels together and returned the salute. I walked to my truck, my old, rusted-out Chevy that Richard had mocked. I climbed in and felt the cold vinyl of the seat. I put the gear in drive. I didn't head for the highway. I didn't head for the airport. I headed toward the two-story house on the hill that smelled like pine and memories. The war was over. But as I pulled out of the lot, I saw a black sedan following 2 cars back. The vultures were gone, but the shadows were still moving. The heater in my Chevy Beater made a noise like a bucket of rusted bolts. It blew tepid, dry air into the cab, smelling of old dust and the faint, metallic scent of the engine working too hard. I drove down the main drag of town, watching the streetlights flicker to life against a sky the color of a bruised plum. The town felt small. It felt like a box I had finally outgrown, yet it was the only place where the air didn't taste like the stagnant, poisoned atmosphere of that courtroom. I pulled into the gravel lot at Frank's Diner. The crunch of the stones under my tires was the only sound in the freezing twilight. I sat there for a minute, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. My knuckles were white. My spine was still a rigid line of military steel. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The thrift store suit was rumpled. I looked tired. I looked like someone who had just crawled out of a trench, but my eyes were clear. The fog was gone. The neon open sign in the window was dark. I pushed the heavy glass door anyway. The bell above the frame gave a tired, familiar jingle. The diner was a cavern of amber shadows and the scent of the day's end. Burnt bacon, industrial floor cleaner, and the heavy, lingering ghost of 1,000 cigarettes smoked in the booths. Frank was there. He was leaning over the long oak counter, a gray rag in his massive hand, scrubbing a stubborn grease stain near the pie display. He didn't look up at the sound of the bell. He didn't need to. He knew my stride. "You're late for your shift, Captain," Frank said. His voice was a low rumble, like a truck idling in the distance. He didn't ask about the verdict. He didn't ask about the $11 million or the vultures who had tried to tear me apart. He didn't look at the suit. To him, I wasn't a headline or a payout. I was just the girl who knew how to handle the 2 a.m. rush without breaking a sweat. I felt my shoulders drop 2 inches. The tension that had been fused into my muscles since the funeral finally began to crack. Traffic was a bitch, I replied. I walked over and sat on the corner stool. The vinyl was cold and cracked, the foam poking through the seams. It felt more like home than the big house on the hill ever would again. Frank stopped scrubbing. He tossed the rag onto the counter and turned around. He reached into the lower cabinet, past the rows of uniform white mugs, and pulled out something different. It was a heavy ceramic mug. It had a pale blue stripe around the rim and a jagged, ugly chip right near the handle where Walter had dropped it on a frozen morning 3 winters ago. Frank had kept it. He'd moved it to the back of the shelf the day my grandfather died, guarding it like a piece of sacred ground. Frank filled it with coffee. It was thick, black, and looked like used motor oil. The steam curled into the air, dancing in the dim light. He pushed the mug across the wood toward me. "Drink it," Frank grunted. "You look like you just spent a week clearing a minefield with a plastic spoon." I wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat was sharp. It seeped through my skin, reaching for the cold that had settled deep in my bones. I took a sip. It was bitter. It was the kind of coffee that stays in the back of your throat, reminding you that you're still alive and the world is still hard. It was perfect. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice steady, "I'm calling Elaine. We're setting up the foundation." Frank nodded once. He didn't need a long explanation. He knew the plan. The $11 million wasn't going to buy a yacht or a condo in Florida. It wasn't going to be used to build a monument to a name. It was going to the VFW hall down the road. It was going to the families of the privates who came back in boxes and the ones who came back but never really left the desert. Walter had started his life in the mud of a family farm, and his money was going back to the people who still had it under their fingernails. It was a mission. The final command of a soldier who had held the line until his heart gave out. "He would have liked that," Frank said. He picked up the rag again. The old man never had much use for fancy things anyway. I looked toward the back of the diner. My canvas apron was still hanging on the pegs by the kitchen door. The coffee stains were still there. The mud from the alley where I had fallen in the slush was dried into the fabric. A dark, permanent map of the night the world went sideways. Mitchell Voss had used that dirt as a weapon. He had tried to use it to prove I was nothing. He was wrong. That dirt was my honor. It was the evidence of every hour I'd spent staying awake, staying close, and staying loyal. The sun finally dipped below the jagged line of the Adirondacks. A single beam of orange light cut through the front window, hitting the apron. It glowed like it was made of gold thread. I took another long draw of the bitter coffee. I didn't need to prove anything to the woman who had abandoned me. I didn't need to explain myself to the man who saw me as a line item on a balance sheet. I had survived the ambush. I had protected the legacy. I stood up and walked to the wall. I ran my hand over the rough canvas of the apron. It was heavy. It was stained. It was mine. The campaign was over. The silent soldier had won the war, and the only thing left to do was keep the coffee hot for the next man coming in from the cold. I turned the closed sign around to open. The shadows were still moving outside, but they didn't matter anymore. I knew exactly where I stood.